The Civil War was a war between the northern states and the southern states. It lasted from 1861 to 1865. Probably the main reason for the Civil War was the issue of slavery. The southern states, being more agriculture, would use the slaves to work the farms, the plantations. The northern states, they had more industry in the north. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, the southern states felt eventually that he would abolish this institution, and they actually decided to leave the Union and form their own country. The southern states decided to leave the Union, or the term is secede. So on April 12, 1861, they made their intentions known by opening fire on Fort Sumter, a U.S. military post in Charleston, South Carolina. They formed their own country called the Confederate States of America. This map will show you the states that did leave the Union. They had their own money, they had their own president, and many of the generals had fought together in the Union Army, but the generals from the South felt most of them, their loyalty was to the southern states, so they resigned their commission in the Union Army, went home, and fought for the Southern Army. The war was fought mostly in the southern states. The casualty count was quite high. It is estimated that 625,000 men lost their lives. That is more lives lost than any war in American history. That was approximately 2% of the male population. And if we put that in terms today, that would be 6 million Americans dying. The butcher bill for some of the battles of the Civil War were absolutely astonishing. Gettysburg, one of the more pivotal battles of the Civil War, 4 days, 46,000 casualties. The Spotsylvania Courthouse campaign, 31,000. Chancellorsville, 30,000. The Wilderness, 26,000. Antietam, one day, the first day, 12,000 casualties. 2 days, 22,000 casualties. Cold Harbor, Virginia, 20 minutes, 7,000 casualties. At the end of the day, 17,000 casualties. These numbers reflect killed, wounded, or missing on these battlefields. It is estimated that 30% of the male population from the southern states were either killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. 2/3 of the soldiers that died during the Civil War died from disease. Another sad fact is 58,000 perished in prison camps. Soldiers from the Confederate Army or the South were called rebels or Johnny Reb. A good percentage of them came from farms, and soldiers from the North, they were called Yankees or Billy Yank. Now, there is a little more diversity here. There were quite a few of them that came from big cities, and there were some that came from like farms from Wisconsin and Minnesota. An interesting thing about the soldiers, well, first of all, the northern soldiers made $13 a month. In both armies, more than likely, you would be fighting from your own area. You'd be fighting with your cousins and your uncles and your fathers. Basically, they were local militias that went to fight in this war. The bad thing about that is, in many cases, these units were totally wiped out and devastated. So these communities lost their male population. A photographer named Matthew Brady during the Civil War sent his men out to the fields, and he instructed them, take pictures of the battlefields after the battles. He wanted to show Americans the carnage and the gore of warfare. Before this, unless you participated in a battle or you viewed a battlefield, you had no idea. I think many people had a romantic view of war where you died nobly and gracefully, but that's not the reality of war. And this was the first time that average citizens could really view the horror, the carnage, and the gore of these scenes. These photographs would be displayed through traveling exhibits throughout the northern states. This is a picture of an elongated bullet made of soft lead, about an inch long, pointed at one end, and hollowed out at the base. This was called a Minié ball. It was invented by Captain Minié of the French Army. The problem for the soldiers, this bullet did horrific damage. This picture of a bone shows you exactly what would happen when the bullet passed through it. It simply was not repairable. When you look at pictures of Civil War veterans, you will see a tremendous amount of amputees. 3/4 of the surgeries done were for amputations. And we have to remember, during that time, doctors were not aware of cleanliness and germs. So the tools, the saws, would be used over and over, as would the bandages. Later on in the war, we learn a little bit more about these things, but many soldiers lost limbs and life. Another thing about this bullet, it was extremely accurate and it flew for longer distances. This picture depicts two soldiers from the 54th Massachusetts Regiment shooting their Springfield rifle loaded with this mini bullet. The Massachusetts 54th was the first black regiment in the Civil War. Oh, by the way, the black soldier only made $10 a month. His white counterpart made $13 a month.
My name is U.S. Grant, and I was the 18th President of the United States. Before that, I fought in the Mexican War. I left the Army and became a businessman, but was not very good at that. I went back into the Army during the Civil War. In 1864, President Lincoln put me in charge of the Union Army, and I was able to defeat Robert E. Lee in the Rebel Army. I'd like to talk about a few first of the Civil War. This is the Gatling gun, or the first machine gun. The first use of trains for military purposes. The first use of aerial observation with hot air balloons. The first income tax. The use of wigwam signals for battlefield communication. My name is Robert E. Lee. When the war broke out, President Lincoln asked me to lead the Northern Army, but I felt my loyalty was to Virginia, so I said no and ended up leading the Southern Army. I am considered one of the greatest generals. I also would like to talk about a few first of the Civil War. The first submarine used in battle was the H.L. Hudley. Extensive use of telegraphs for communication. First use of ironclad ships. First use of battlefield ambulances. Telescopic sights used by the snipers. My name is Abraham Lincoln. I was the 16th president. Many people think I was the most important president. I was the president during the Civil War. I wrote the Emancipation Proclamation, a document that freed the slaves. I refused to allow the southern states to leave the Union, so I preserved the Union. I wrote the Gettysburg Address, one of the great American speeches. By the way, my record as a wrestler was 300 wins, 1 loss. I am in the Wrestling Hall of Fame.
Jeff Daniels, who starred in the movie Gettysburg, played Joshua Chamberlain. In this rendition, he will recite the Gettysburg Address. It is one of the most famous speeches in American history.
"Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here, dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.